A very common question we get when it comes to mastering is how loud should the master be? And also how much headroom should there be? So I thought, why not make a little investigation and see what the current trends are? So this is the top 50 global chart on Spotify, the top songs in the world at the moment, and we will zoom in on the 10 first tracks. And we're going to look at loudness and peak levels, both sample levels and true peak levels, and also see if we can figure out what methods for peak limiting have been used. And try to answer questions like, is the loudness war over yet? Does anyone leave the 1 dB of headroom that is often recommended for streaming? And are there any intersample peaks? Just to geek out a little bit and see what is actually being done on modern releases. My name is Thomas and I run this channel together with Sofia. We have been working with mastering for many years and we try to share things here that can be helpful. So I've done a bit of preparation before recording this video and I have analyzed the first 10 tracks in this playlist. And there are a few things that we can see right away. For example, many of these tracks have an integrated loudness of around -8 LUFS. The average in this list is around -8 LUFS. And -8 LUFS it's quite loud, but it's not terribly loud. I would say from loudness war perspective for modern music, pop music and rock music, -8 is a quite good level to be at, actually, especially nowadays when we have good peak limiters that can let the music stay pretty intact even at louder levels. So I was actually quite positively surprised that the average loudness is around -8 LUFS. There is one song that is noticeably quieter than the others at -13 LUFS, and there's one song that is noticeably louder than the others at -5.1 LUFS. And -5 LUFS, that's definitely in the loudness war territory, but it can of course still sound very good. It very much depends on the music and the arrangement and how the loudness has been achieved. We will have a closer look at that shortly. And when it comes to peak levels and headroom, we can see that several of these tracks go all the way up to 0 dBFS, and most of them are very close to 0 dBFS, at least for the peak levels of the actual samples. And when it comes to the true peak levels, we can see that many of the tracks are above 0 dBFS, with one of the songs having true peak levels of up to 1.4 dBFS. And I often hear the recommendation to keep the peak levels at -1 dB, to leave 1 dB of headroom, and also to keep the true peak levels under control so that we don't get these intersample peaks. But as we can see here, these recommendations are not something that is followed in the real world, at least not for these releases that end up in the charts. And I will get back to intersample peaks and also why we would want to have a bit of headroom for streaming platforms. I will talk more about that a little later in the video. And let's have a closer look at the meters and at the waveforms. And I will not play any audio in this video because that would just trigger a bunch of copyright claims. But we can still have a look at the waveforms and the meters. So for example, now if we play the first song here, we can see that the sample peak levels stay quite nicely at -0.2 dBFS, but the true peak levels are louder than that. And for the most part, this doesn't really matter that much. These intersample peaks will be inaudible in most cases. there are certain situations where they can be audible, but for music that is already quite peak limited, maybe even clipped, and there are artifacts from that process, then these additional artifacts that can come from intersample peaks will usually not be audible in that context. But it is, of course, possible to also have the intersample peaks in control. So, for example, the second track here, if we jump a bit further into the song, we can see that the peak levels are well behaved, both for the sample levels and also for the true peak levels. So in this case, the mastering engineer has probably used a peak limiter that is also taking the true peaks into account. And if we look at the loudest song in the playlist, then we can see that the peak levels for the sample values are well behaved and peaks at minus 0.2, and that also the true peak levels are quite well behaved. It's peaking at 0 dBFS. So in this case, both the sample values and the true peak levels are under control, so to speak. But we can also see on the goniometer here that the method for peak limiting seems to be quite a lot of clipping. And clipping was usually the main method of peak limiting back in the loudness war days. And often we would use the AD converter for loudness. So when having analog equipment and going back into the DAW, we would hit the AD converter with a too loud level so that it clipped. And that sound that you can get from clipping an AD converter often sounded better than the peak limiting options that were available back then. So seeing this kind of shape on the goniometer is a bit of a blast from the past, but it's still quite common in some cases to use clipping for loudness, and there's nothing wrong with it as long as it sounds good. This track sounds nice, I think. The clipping is part of the sound. There's a lot of distortion going on in the mix itself. And often when you want to push the loudness, then you will need to accept some of the side effects that comes with that, and then you can sort of lean into the sound of clipping and make that a part of the musical expression, so to speak. And this clipping is also something we can see if we zoom into the waveform. So these flat tops are the things that make the goniometer seem to have sharp edges. And if the goniometer looks more like this, then there's usually a peak limiter involved that has a look ahead or some sort of more advanced way of dealing with the peak levels. And we can also see that if we zoom in, that even on these loud kick drums, for example, we can see that there is no clipping. And this isn't necessarily better or worse than using clipping. It sounds different, and it very much depends on what the music sounds like, which kind of peak limiting that is best to use. And sometimes we need to switch between different types of peak limiting within the song if we want to chase these loud levels. So another thing we can say about the levels and the loudness is that when the listener is listening to the playlist without loudness normalization, then all the songs will be played back at the level that they were mastered at. And most of the songs that we have looked at now are around -8 LUFS approximately. So they will sound approximately at the same loudness, even with loudness normalization disabled. The one exception in this case is the song that was the quietest in the playlist at -13 LUFS. This will sound a bit quieter than the others without loudness normalization. And the song that was the loudest in the playlist will sound a bit louder. But overall, the levels in the playlist are fairly consistent. And I thought maybe it's interesting to see what happens after loudness normalization. When all of these tracks are normalized to minus 14 LUFS, this is what we end up with. And all of the tracks are louder than minus 14 LUFS, so they will all be turned down in level. But this track that was the quietest track is the one that also gets turned down the least. So in the end, all the songs will sound about the same loudness after loudness normalization. And the thing I noticed when I skipped between these songs was that this quietest song was the one that stood out the most to my ears. It's the most dynamic track, so the loud parts in this track really pops out after loudness normalization. So let's talk a little bit about headroom and why there is a sort of recommendation to leave 1 dB of headroom between the loudest peaks and 0 dBFS. For example, Apple recommends leaving 1 dB of headroom when delivering masters for Apple Digital Masters, the thing that was previously called Mastered for iTunes. Well, the reason for that is that most streaming platforms use some sort of lossy encoding when distributing the music to the listener. This can be AAC or OGG Vorbis or MP3 or some other lossy format. And the main reason for that is to save bandwidth, both for the user and for the platform itself. And the way these lossy formats work is that they divide the audio into many small components and then prioritize which of these components are audible for the listener and give those components the most bits and give fewer bits to the components that are deemed to be not audible, and some of the components are thrown away altogether. And the goal is to only encode the parts of the signal that the listener will actually hear, so that when the file is played back, it will sound identical to the original file, but it will be much smaller in size. So the goal is that it should sound identical, but that doesn't mean that the waveform itself will look identical. And the thing that often happens is that the peak levels in the original file will not stay the same. The signal will often grow, so to speak, and the resulting waveform will have bigger peaks than the original. So the recommended headroom of 1 dB is simply to make some room for these bigger peaks that happen after encoding to lossy formats. And in general, the higher the bitrate is used for the lossy encoding, the less problems there will be with these peak levels. And with lossless playback, there is no problem at all of this kind. And several platforms nowadays offer lossless playback. So what happens if there is very little headroom or no headroom in the files, just as in the examples we have looked at in this video? Well, then there is no room for the waveform to grow, so it will run into clipping instead during playback. And this can be audible and it can be inaudible. That's very hard to predict without actually encoding the files and listening to the result. And since there are many different types of encoders and bit rates used on the streaming platforms, it's very difficult to exactly be sure whether the distortion will be audible or not. But it's the same as with intersample peaks. The signals that tend to grow the most are the signals that are heavily limited or clipped. That's the kind of signal that tend to cause a bit more problems when using lossy encoding. But that's also the kind of material that probably has quite a lot of artifacts already from peak limiting and clipping. So there may not be any problems with a bit of additional crunch from the lossy encoding. But having 1 dB of headroom would also mean that we would either need to lower the overall loudness of the file with 1 dB or use 1 dB more of limiting or clipping. if we want to keep the same loudness. So however we think about this, there will always be some sort of compromise. We will either need to lower the level a bit, or we would need to limit the material even more, or we could just reduce the amount of headroom and go all the way up to 0 dBFS and effectively have the master 1 dB louder. But leaving 1 dB of headroom usually means that there will be no surprises. We have a predictable outcome for most lossy encoders. So in the end, we need to kind of choose between predictable outcome, less limiting, or more loudness. We can only pick two of those, basically. And there is a similar decision to be made about intersample peaks. The problems that can appear with intersample peaks or true peaks above 0 dBFS is that the signal can be resampled somewhere along the line. So if the streaming app is outputting 44.1 kilohertz, for example, but the audio interface is set to 48 kilohertz, then the signal will be resampled at some point. And when it is resampled, then the intersample peaks can end up as actual sample value peaks. And this can cause clipping in some cases. And this doesn't have to be an issue at all. There are many situations where this resampled signal won't cause any clipping even if it grows. But just as with the lossy encoding, this is a situation that we really haven't got any control over when we are mastering. The only thing we can do really is to make sure that the master doesn't have any true peaks above 0 dBFS. So for recordings that are meant to be very high fidelity and clean sounding, then I think it's a very good idea to make sure that there is headroom for lossy encoding and that we also have the true peak levels under control. But for music that is already quite hyped and already have distortion and artifacts from peak limiting, then this may not be a big issue at all. But I think it's good to be aware of these things at least. So what are the takeaways from all of this? Well, if we want to fit in on the Top Songs Global playlist on Spotify, then we should aim for a loudness of approximately -8 LUFS, and we should limit the sample peaks to somewhere slightly below 0 dBFS, like -0.1 dBFS or something, and we shouldn't care too much about the intersample peaks or the true peak levels. And whether this is good advice or not, I'm not really sure. Personally, I like to have a bit more control over both the sample peak levels and the true peak levels. But -8 LUFS for modern pop and rock music is actually quite a sane loudness, I think. I was actually expecting it to be louder than that when I started looking into this. And maybe we should have a look at other playlists as well. Maybe dive into some genre, maybe look at the state of metal today, see where we have the levels there. Maybe that's something we can do in a future video. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.